Shalom, Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. Welcome to our Messianic History series. This is the story of the reemergence of Messianic Judaism beginning in the 1800s. It's also the story of the translation of the New Testament into Hebrew. But it's more than that. It's the story of the return of the Jewish Jesus. It's the story of the beginning of his reappearance. As such, it's the story of how Jews began to see Yeshua as the Jewish Messiah, and continue to identify as Jews and live Jewish lives after hundreds and hundreds of years of that not happening. It's the story of the New Testament being restored to its original Jewish context. It's like its original Jewish voice was given back to it. So in this Messianic History series, we're going to be starting with the history of the Hebrew New Testament. Firstly, the London Society's pioneering translation of the New Testament into Hebrew. First edition came out in 1817, and this third cantillated version came out in 1865. We'll then be looking at the Zolkinson-Ginsburg Hebrew New Testament, more of a poetic paraphrase, which came out in 1885 using a more pure biblical Hebrew. And then finally, after looking at these two versions, we'll be looking at the Delitzsch Hebrew New Testament, which first came out in 1877, was the most literal word-for-word version, closest to how the New Testament writers would have actually written in Hebrew. And then after we have looked at the history of the Hebrew New Testament, we will also be looking at about half a dozen men who, along with the translators of the Hebrew New Testament, were regarded as the fathers of modern Messianic Judaism, some of the very first emerging Messianic Jewish voices. I'm really excited about this, and as you can see in the center of this picture, we have Professor Franz Delitzsch himself. We're going to be orienting our history around the professor and his story, because he was probably the greatest Hebrew scholar of the 1800s. Definitely the best Christian Hebraist in terms of Christian scholars of Hebrew. Also, as I had mentioned, he came out with the best and most widely used Hebrew New Testament. Also because he was something of a father figure to the men who became the fathers of the modern Messianic Jewish movement. So more than anyone, I believe that it was Professor Delitzsch who was the grandfather, the spiritual grandfather of Messianic Judaism. Professor Delitzsch's story is also a who's who of Messianic history and of Hebrew scholarship in the 1800s. His biographer, whom you will be meeting shortly, said, quote, "One of his most remarkable traits was in his friendship for authors and publishers, both old and young. He kept in most intimate connection with the heart of the learned world in his department. He knew personally, or stood in a correspondence with almost every Semitic scholar whose acquaintance was worth having, if he was inclined to be friendly, and sometimes worked in partnership with him." So we will be beginning this story with a couple episodes giving you the life story of Professor Franz Delitzsch up to the time when he began his work on the Hebrew New Testament. And then after we've started our episodes with that, we will go over the history of these three versions of the Hebrew New Testament, culminating in Professor Delitzsch's version. After that, like I said, we'll jump over to looking at some of these early Messianic Jewish voices and father figures, and then finally we will conclude all of these episodes with the rest of the story of Professor Franz Delitzsch. So in this first episode, we will be looking at Professor Delitzsch's birth, his childhood, and his youth. And before we look at that, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the source texts that we will primarily be drawing from as we look at the history, the personal history, the story really, of Professor Delitzsch. And this will be an example also of how we will be navigating this history in general. I'm pulling together a tremendous amount of material, original source texts, and putting it together into something of a flowing narrative. So I'll be showing you these texts. We'll be looking at quotes and excerpts and pictures, and we'll keep the story moving forward in that way. So just like if you were reading let's say a book, a history book, you would have the sources usually cited in the footnotes or at the back of the book. That's kind of like what we'll be doing here, but instead of them being in the footnotes, I'll just show you the sources, and we'll be working directly from them. So firstly, I'll show you a little lineup of sources for Professor Delitzsch himself. So here we have a short autobiography that Franz Delitzsch himself wrote. Came out originally in the Old Testament Student in 1887. It's 5 pages long, and it furnishes personal details about the life of the professor that we won't see elsewhere. I wanted you to note in particular here briefly. It mentions another professor, SDF Salmond, whom you will meet shortly, and he came out with a short but excellent sketch of his Leipzig friend in the Expositor. So keep your eyes open for that. You'll note here that this was produced with introduction and notes by Professor Hermann V. Hilprecht, and here's a picture of Hermann Vollrath Hilprecht himself. And if you look him up, you will discover, as you can see here, that amongst other things, he studied at Leipzig. Here, I'm going to get out of the way for a split second here so you can see this better. Okay, so he studied and he received his PhD at Leipzig in 1883. So he studied under Delitzsch, and Delitzsch was a significant figure in his formative years. And then he went on from there to become a famous Assyriologist and archaeologist. Delitzsch's autobiography, as you saw, it's short. It's like 5 pages long. It's also included in the back of the best longer form biography about him, and this is the biography phrased as a memorial tribute by Samuel Ives Curtis, which was first published a year after Delitzsch's death in 1890. This came out in 1891, and if we turn the pages, you'll see there's a picture of the professor, and then also a table of contents giving you a sense of what is covered here. And as we look at some of these texts, as you can see, we're moving pretty fast. We're not being super thorough. You may want to go more in depth into some of these things. So we do have a Messianic history PDF collection containing all of these texts and more, these original sources that we're working from, and you can get that for yourself. If you're watching this on the website, look for the link probably at the top of the page. If you're watching this on a video hosting platform, the link should be in the video description. So just look around, and you should be able to find that, and then you can spend more time looking at these source texts for yourself. And if you want more information, it's a great way of doing it. All right, so a little bit of information is given here in the preface. Apparently, Samuel Ives Curtis knew Delitzsch on an intimate acquaintance beginning in 1873. So that was, 17 or 18 years before Delitzsch's passing, and this work was published. So it's very helpful. And as you can see, he talks here about it's detailed, and he did his best to corroborate this information in person, and it's really quite an honest look at the story based on original documents and interviews. All right, so here's a picture of Samuel Ives Curtis, and there is a short biography of him. We won't go over this in too much detail. I did want to point out here that, as you can see here, Curtis spent 4 years in Leipzig, and in Leipzig, Professor Curtis became the special friend and pupil of Delitzsch, who was a great Hebraist and warm patron of young scholars. Delitzsch led him to make Old Testament studies his life's work, gave him private instruction, directed his reading, put manuscript material at his disposal, introduced him to distinguished Orientalists, opened doors to literary treasures, and, when ripe for a professorship, warmly recommended him for the vacant chair in Chicago. So clearly there was a very close relationship there, and it was very influential in this young life. You can see here that he traveled back to Leipzig in 1880, 1881, 1883, and then if you were to read on, you'll see that he also traveled back after Delitzsch's death to collect the information that he compiled in this biography and just to corroborate as many facts as possible. All right, so that's going to be our main work that we'll be drawing from. We also have here the work of S.D.F. Salmond, which first came out in the Expositor in June of 1886. It's 16 pages long. Salmond also wrote a 3-page tribute in the Expository Times, which came out in 1890 in conjunction with the death of Delitzsch. Here's a little bit of information about him. His full name was Stuart Dingwall Fordyce Salmond, and people just don't name their kids stuff like this anymore. But maybe it's time for a comeback. So he was a Scottish professor and college principal, and as you can see here, he studied at Erlangen, which was probably where he got to know Professor Delitzsch, because he was a professor at Erlangen also. All right, another tribute that is useful is that of Samuel Rolls Driver, 4 pages long. And here's a little bit of information about Driver himself. He was one of the great Christian Hebraists, Hebrew scholars of the 1800s, probably best known for his contributions to the Brown Driver and Briggs lexicon, the BDB. If you're familiar with it, he put the driver in Brown Driver and Briggs. We also have a really heartwarming and affectionate 8-page tribute by W., I believe his last name would be spelled Baudissin, I'm going to guess, which was actually written, here's a little bit of the story here, written before Delitzsch's death. And you can see Delitzsch's response here, which was just such a beautiful look at Delitzsch's heart and the relationship he had with the many, many students that he taught and influenced. And but at the same time, he didn't want it to be released until after his death. So this was released after Delitzsch's death, but Delitzsch got to read it and have his heart, I'm sure, touched by it from what he said. So here's a little bit about Baudissin also. Another fantastic old name, Wolf Wilhelm Friedrich Graf von Baudissin. And you can see here that he earned his doctorate in 1870 at Leipzig. So another man who was significantly influenced by Delitzsch in his time. We're also going to be drawing from a tribute that came out in the Jewish Quarterly Review at the time of the death of Delitzsch. And this is especially unique and valuable because it's how the professor was seen through Jewish eyes. It's 14 pages long. And I want you to note here that it was written by David Kaufman. A quick little bit of information for you about Kaufman. It sounds like he was another person who had a significant relationship with the professor. It says here, let's see. This is the Jewish Encyclopedia, by the way. You can look it up for yourself. Also, in the summer of 1874, he received his PhD from the University of Leipzig. So, no doubt, he came in contact with Delitzsch and probably learned from him there. We do have several other biographies and tributes in our Messianic History PDF collection, but they're smaller. They don't really say anything that these more main ones don't say, so we're just going to skip those from now. I'm trying to keep this as light as possible. I will also refer you to this. It's a 500-page biography of Franz Delitzsch and his life and work. It came out in 1978. Unfortunately, for those of us who do not speak German, it is all in German. But nonetheless, if you actually look at like what's covered here, we're going to be covering a fair bit of this as we look at these biographies and tributes, and as we look at the actual works of Professor Delitzsch. So don't feel like you're missing out on too much. One of the reasons I'm pointing this one out to you specifically is because it's an example of how this Messianic History series is not comprehensive. And we don't have a comprehensive collection of sources. There are sources in German and sources in Hebrew, and these have never been translated. So there's much work to be done. Hopefully, many of these sources, these books and articles in other languages, will eventually be translated, and at that point, we'll have new information that comes to light. So my hope in this Messianic History series is not that it will be the be-all, end-all, but rather that it will be the beginning of the path of many, delving in much greater detail into the story of how Messianic Judaism reemerged, how the New Testament was given its original Jewish voice back. And if you do come across information that we don't cover here, that isn't in our Messianic History PDF collection, please do contact me. The best way of doing that is probably through the contact page at holylanguage.com. All right. Quick note also, before we talk about the birth of Professor Franz Delitzsch, and that is how to pronounce his last name. You'll probably hear it pronounced either Delitzsch or Delitzsch. And I looked into this. I have a close friend who's German and a German speaker. And he said, yes, they're actually both right. Delitzsch is how it's pronounced in Low German. And then in Higher German, which is your more standardized pronunciation, it is Delitzsch. Delitzsch. And so you'll hear it pronounced both ways. So if you want to go with the more proper German pronunciation, it's going to be Delitzsch. However, I'm going to go with Delitzsch because that's how it's more commonly pronounced in English, and that's just what English speakers do. They say names with an English pronunciation. All right. So just a quick note about that for you. The actual story of Professor Franz Delitzsch begins in Leipzig, Germany, which is roughly here, as you can see on a map. And it doesn't actually begin with his birth. It begins roughly 10 years before that, in 1803. This is roughly what the city of Leipzig looked like in the mid-1800s. So if you can imagine 50 years before that, June 1st, 1803, a young 20-year-old man named Johann Delitzsch was marrying a young lady named Susanna. Over the next 10 years, they had 2 babies, and tragically, they lost both of those babies. Their third child was born on February 23rd, 1813, touched down here on the European continent, and Johann and Susanna Delitzsch named him Franz Julius Delitzsch. He was baptized on March 4th, 1813, here at the St. Nicholas Church. And if you're interested in some information about this church, there's some here. It's actually quite a fascinating place, definitely a center historically, culturally, and even politically, if you're not familiar with the Monday demonstrations, which did much to bring down the wall between Western and Eastern Germany. They started at the St. Nicholas Church. Here's a picture of Leipzig at evening. It's a very pretty place, but it can also be a bit of a scary place. This is a massive monument in Leipzig. You can see these are people, these little tiny people. And this is a monument that is called the Volkerschlachtdenkmal, a massive monument commemorating something that happened half a year before baby Franz was born, when he was in utero. And this monument is a commemoration of that. Here's a little bit of information about the Volkerschlachtdenkmal, which in English is usually called the Monument to the Battle of the Nations. And we'll look at another page with some information about this great battle in just a moment. But I wanted to point out to you here is that this monument was the scene of fighting in World War II, where, quote, Leipzig's defenders, in other words, the Nazis, made their last stand against U.S. troops. So this was this was actually the site of one of the Nazis' last stands. And here's a picture of the inside of the monument shortly after that. I assume this was after the Nazis were routed and rooted out of the monument. The upstairs of the monument, as you can see here, it has 4 massive statues, and each one of these represent one of the 4 strengths of the Germanic peoples: faith, bravery, sacrifice, and fertility. And I see that this one here is, it looks like it's a mother with 2 babies, nursing 2 babies. I assume that represents fertility. And when I saw this, it also reminded me of how Franz's mother, Susanna, lost her first 2 babies before young Franz was born. All right, so this is a memorial of the biggest battle in Europe before World War I. And it's simply called the Battle of Leipzig, or also it's called the Battle of the Nations. And as you can see from the information here, there were over 500,000 troops massed in the area. It was a huge clash between the French armies under Napoleon and the troops that were opposing them. And a remarkable thing happened towards the end of this battle, and this is recorded by Delitzsch's biographer Curtis, whom we will be encountering frequently in these particular episodes. So Franz's mother, Susanna, she had recently had him, and she was standing in the door of her house, holding baby Franz in her arms, and watching the soldiers walk past on the street, when a soldier walking past her stopped and stretched out his hand and put it on her baby's head and said, "Mama, Mama, this child will one day be a great man." It sounds rather prophetic to me. We will come back to this monument and the Battle of the Nations and some incredible symbolism in connection with this at the end of our series. For now, I just want you to remember that Leipzig was the city where the Battle of the Nations was fought at the beginning of the 1800s when Napoleon was turned back. It was also the place which was one of the Nazis' last stands in the middle of the 1900s. And then between that time, it was the city where Professor Franz Delitzsch lived, translated the New Testament into Hebrew, and did more than anyone to see the modern Messianic Jewish movement born. So that's a bit about the birth of Professor Franz Delitzsch, and we will be returning to this at the end of our series. Let's move on now to look at some information in connection with his boyhood. So, in his own words, Delitzsch said, "I grew up poor." He grew up poor, and he had a hard childhood. In his own words, my father had a shop where he dealt in second-hand goods, a so-called frippery. This brought him in very little, and I passed an arduous childhood. So in other words, he had a hard childhood. Franz's father, Johann, was also an alcoholic. He didn't like having his kid around, and young Franz spent most of his time when he was at home hiding in his bedroom. This was hard because they lived in tenement housing on the 3rd floor, and their apartment only had 3 rooms. In his biography, Curtis actually went to the location and described it thus: "The first room, after reaching the landing, was 6 by 6 feet. The next, the family room, was 10 by 11 feet, and opening out of this was a dark chamber, 12 by 13 feet. So I think it's safe to say that young Franz's father failed him. But notably, at the same time, someone else did fill that role in his life. Young Franz had a mysterious godfather who was born in 1776 and was 37 years old when Franz was born. On his baptismal certificate, this mysterious godfather was listed as having the same name, Franz Julius. But he's nowhere to be found elsewhere with that name. The only reason it was there on his certificate is because he was Jewish. And specifically, he belonged to a class of Jews called Schutzjuds. And hopefully I'm saying that right. Basically, this class of Jews was Jewish people with rights of residency and legal protection. So, in his own words, Delitzsch says, "My benefactor from childhood was a Jew named Hirsch Levy. He lived with us in one house and dealt in books. If it had not been for him, I could never have succeeded in studying." There's so much left there unsaid. We don't know how the family came in contact with this Jewish individual. We don't know how he ended up living with them in their tiny apartment on the 3rd floor, but this is what happened. And he actually had a book stall, and we actually know the exact location of this book stall. So if you were to look it up on Google Maps, it's at this intersection right here. And I'll point out to you briefly here anyways. There are a couple things that could be pointed out here. There's the St. Nicholas Church in the neighborhood, and then there's also the University of Leipzig. It wasn't the biggest town, so everything is really quite close together. Mentions here Leipzig University. Trying to see where that church was. I think it's might be right here if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Anyways, look it up on Google Maps if you want. And I also took some street level screenshots for you using Google Maps. And I'm going to show you the view in all 4 directions from this intersection while reading another quote to you from Curtis's biography. He said, "It is not improbable that in the stall, which was kept alternately by Uncle Hirsch and his mother, and which was much patronized by the university students, he found abundant inspiration, and that here the foundation was laid for his literary career." Delitzsch goes on to tell a little bit more about his childhood. "First, I went to a boys' school, and after that I attended the free school of the town, where at this time Plato was director and Doles vice director." And you can see a little bit about Plato and Doles here. Here's a picture of the school, and then here's another picture also. So you can imagine young Franz going to school here. In his biography, Curtis wrote, "Although he speaks of his childhood as a hard one, he was nevertheless a merry, exceedingly lively lad, and so zealous in gymnastics that he dangerously injured one of his eyes." So Delitzsch went to school here until 1827 at the age of 14. He then went for 3 years, from the ages of 14 to 17, which was 1827 to 1830 here. And at the old Nikolai school, you have to appreciate that the students of this school were referred to as the Nicolaitans. So apparently Delitzsch in his teens was a true Nicolaitan. Here's another picture of it for you. Delitzsch studied Hebrew and Greek here. At the final examination, Delitzsch was reported to have spoken Greek fluently with one of his professors, Professor Grossman. He also wrote poetry. In fact, 5 of his poems were featured in the graduation program, where it was also noted that he planned to study theology. At the same time, Delitzsch also said about this time in his life, "Here I became a decided rationalist. I felt myself drawn to God, but the person of Jesus Christ was to me shrouded in utter darkness." So that's a bit about the boyhood of Franz Delitzsch. So we'll move on to his young manhood, which was his late teens and his 20s. And much of this time was spent at the U of L, the University of Leipzig. This is what it looks like today. Take special note of this part of the building, and we're going to now travel back in time, and you can see what it would have looked like at the time of Professor Delitzsch. So there you can see there's that same front, although it has certainly been touched up over time. So Delitzsch spent 13 years here, roughly from the age 18 to age 31, and it all started with his moving to the U of L in 1831 when he was 18, sponsored by his uncle Hirsch. This was an intensely formative time in young Franz's life. So we're gonna talk about his years here, and we're gonna break it up into three themes. Firstly, we'll talk about his early spiritual growth. Then we'll look at his budding academic career, and finally, you'll be introduced to a couple of the first Jewish people that he became friends with or that he learned from, some early Jewish relationships that proved to be defining. So, firstly, his spiritual growth during this time. It was around when Franz went to the U of L that he had a supernatural encounter with Yeshua. In his own words, "I went to the university to study philosophy and philology, and while seeking for truth, I became absorbed in the systems of the great German philosophers. But one of my university fellows, called Schutz, who had found the Savior and loved him, worked incessantly to bring me to believe. I resisted a long time, but to this very day I can point out the specific street corner in Leipzig where a light from above flashed around me like a bolt of lightning, and I heard a voice saying to me, 'Do not be lacking in faith. Rather, you must surely believe.' And like Thomas, I too proclaimed, 'My Lord and my God!' Henceforth I became a theologian. I sought interaction with other students who had been awakened by the mercy of God, and cultivated the acquaintance of believing family circles in Leipzig." Delitzsch got into the devotional and mystical literature from the Lutheran and Catholic traditions, and in particular began reading the writings of the mystic Jacob Boehme. Throughout his 20s, he was involved with an informal small group. I think we would probably call this a house church today. And this is what Delitzsch had to say about those years of his life, and just how formative they were spiritually, especially his involvement with this little house church, shall we call it. So firstly, from when he was 19 to 21, he said, "The years from 1832 to 1834, my last 3 years at the university, were the happiest of my life. They were the spring of my spiritual life, the days of my first love. There were domestic circles of believers in Leipzig, where I felt quite at home." And then he goes on to describe his years from when he was 22 to 29. "For 7 years, 1835 to 1842, I led the devotional meetings in a circle of believing friends. Some of the members still live, and when we meet, we confess that our anchor still rests upon the old ground. My communion book originated from the devotional gatherings, which I conducted." So a quick little bit about his communion book. It was first published in 1844 when he was 31, and probably contained a lot of the prayers that he prayed over these years with his little house church group. It became very popular, and this is a look at the 7th edition. This edition came out in 1876. The 7th edition came out in 1886, if I'm not mistaken. So this is German, but what it says is the sacrament of the true body and blood of Jesus Christ, confession and communion prayers. And I'm going to read you an excerpt of one of these prayers, a translation from the German, so that you can get a sense of the spiritual life of Professor Delitzsch in his 20s. And just the fire that he had in his spirit. "Lord Jesus, help us through the spirit of promise to recognize you and your Father, whose name is in you, and in faith to embrace you and to love you, although we do not see you with the eyes of sense. How else could we return to God in our separation from him, except through you? You are the way. How could we be delivered from the pain of doubt and the instability of human opinion, except as we hold on to the word of God through your divine mouth. You are the truth. And how could we joyfully go into death if your pierced body were not, as it were, the rent veil of the other world? You are the life. You have overcome death and Hades. You have opened heaven for us. We kiss in spirit the marks of the nails in your body pierced for us, and cast ourselves at your feet, which were fastened to the cross for us, and pray to you as the incarnate love who has shed your blood for us, and cry with Thomas, treading all doubting thoughts beneath our feet, my Lord and my God. So maybe that gives you a sense of the deep devotion and spiritual passion that Professor Franz Delitzsch developed in his late teens and in his 20s, and it's no doubt that is the fire that carried him throughout his life and fueled his scholarship and his work. About this communion book, biographer Curtis wrote, "If he had not left the church anything else than his communion book, with its mystical depth and spirituality, in which he embodied the best of his personality, thousands upon thousands who have taken this book as their guide to the altar would bless him for it. Yes, strengthen thy brethren." All right, so that's a bit of the early spiritual life of Franz Delitzsch. Let's look now at his budding academic career at the U of L, where it all had its start. And this is, again, what it looks like today. This is a closer look at what it would have looked like back in the time of Franz when he went there. So basically, Franz studied here for roughly 4 years, after which in 1834, when he was 21 years old, he was made a professor extraordinarius. And so basically, you'd think that that's like the wow professor, but actually no, like the basically this is a quick look at some of these academic offices in Germany from Wikipedia. So a professor ordinarius, that's the one you really want to be. That's a professor with a chair. A professor extraordinarius doesn't get a chair. And Curtis had a bit of a comment about that. Meanwhile, he was invited as a professor ordinarius to Königsberg, but he declined because he was a strict Lutheran, and Königsberg combined the Lutheran and Reformed confessions in what is known as the Union. Curtis also wrote, "To his last breath, he remained in his theology a decided Lutheran, although without any narrowness, not as if mere orthodoxy was of the highest importance. He insisted on spiritual life, on personal Christianity, on personal fellowship with the Lord, not as if he had found in mere scientific work the chief blessing for the kingdom of God. He feared that mere intellectualism, without unction, would result from the development of theology in our day. And how full of unction was the work of his life." In 1836, when Delitzsch was 23, he finished his first book. He said, quote, "In my youthful enthusiasm for the Jewish literature, I wrote my book, The History of the Post-Biblical Jewish Poetry." Curtis expounded, "His maiden effort, so far as I am aware, in bookmaking, was a learned treatise on the history of Jewish poetry, from the conclusion of the Holy Scriptures of the Old Covenant until the most recent times," unquote. That's the title, in which he mentions over 400 Jewish poets and poems. If he read these in the most superficial way, this would be a remarkable performance for a young man of 23, but it bears marks of careful reading and study. When Delitzsch was in his 20s, the only Hebrew New Testament available was the first edition of the London Society, which originally came out in 1817, as I had already mentioned. It was primitive. It wasn't the best. It had some serious issues. And yes, we will be looking at this version beginning in episode 4. So you can look forward to that. In the meantime, though, this was what was out there. And Delitzsch commented, quote, "Even at that time, I entertained the plan of undertaking the work," that is the work of translating the New Testament into Hebrew, "and if possible, of producing something more thorough. In the translation of the apostolic hymn on love, 1 Corinthians 13, I gave a specimen. So this was in 1838 when Delitzsch was 25 years old. And really it was the foreglimmering of his life's greatest work, translating the New Testament into the holy language of the Jewish people. This little specimen was titled Sample of a New Hebrew Translation of the New Testament by Franz Julius Delitzsch. It included a critique of the London Society's Hebrew New Testament, and for now I just wanted to tell you that much. Like I said, we'll be looking at the London Society's version later, and then after we've looked at the London Society and Zalkins and Ginsburg versions, we will look at the history of Delitzsch's translation in greater detail. When Delitzsch was 29, he took the next step in his own words. In the year 1842, I habilitated myself in Leipzig with a thesis on the prophet Habakkuk. So this was something that came out a year later in 1843. And I want you to note here, mentions a doctor of philosophy, licentiate, and private docent of theology at the University of Leipzig. Notice this name too, Karl Paul Kaspari. You will be meeting him in just a couple of minutes also. And so if you're wondering what a private docent is and a habilitation, here's another look at some of these positions in the German academic world. So it's a member of a faculty who's passed the habilitation, and comparable to the English American assistant or adjunct professor. And notice here that they are obligated to lecture. And indeed, Delitzsch did lecture. Here's a quick look at his lecture schedule before he got married and moved to Rostock. So roughly from this time, he was already lecturing 4 times a week in the summer, and then just from Isaiah in 1842, then in winter, Psalms and Habakkuk, which we already just touched on. And so I was like, I'm going to back up just briefly for a second here. Okay. So it looks like this is more, this that came out in 1843, it looks like this is more the prophets in general. So, I assume that his work on Habakkuk would have been in here. But as you can see, he was lecturing on some of these prophets right around then when this little book came out. So Habakkuk here, Zephaniah here, etc. So regarding Delitzsch's lecturing abilities, Curtis wrote, "Whatever criticisms may be made regarding a lack of exact scientific method of presentation, he had that which is the most important characteristic of a great teacher, the power to inspire his pupils. This is of more value than the ability to beat into them certain dry details. Any pedagogue could do that. But if any man could take his hearers up to the third heavens and show them things which were unutterable, it was Delitzsch." All right, so we'll finish this first episode looking at the early years of Professor Delitzsch, looking at some of his first Jewish relationships. And some of these weren't with Jewish people specifically, but were with people who helped connect him with Judaism and with the study of Hebrew. So we'll begin with looking at an excerpt from the history of the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews. And we'll be encountering this every now and then. So this came out in 1908, as you can see here. And we will turn to page 409. And as you can see here, there's a little mention of Delitzsch. It says, okay, so this was after his passing. They're talking about him, and they're saying, "The Society's missionaries, F.W. Becker and J.B. Goldberg, were the first to direct his mind to Jewish studies and to their evangelization, of which he was such a doughty champion." I hope I'm saying doughty right. That's not a word most of us use every day. And then you can see here, there's a bit more information about J.P. Goldberg. So J.P. Goldberg, as you can see, he was Jewish, a Jewish convert to Christianity. And so we have a little bit of information about Goldberg. It says he visited Leipzig annually at the time of the great fairs, which used to be attended by Jews from all parts of Europe. There he found a large field for missionary activity. Okay, and there's a little bit more about Leipzig here. Second town of importance in Saxony, large industrial and commercial center, numerous Jewish population. Mentions the university as early as 1820. Okay, so then more information there. We can skip that. So about this, Delitzsch himself said, I came into communication with the Jewish missionaries Goldberg and Becker, who visited the fairs at Leipzig in order to work among the Jews. Both these men first taught me to love the people, from whom the Savior sprang, according to the flesh. And here's a little bit of information specifically about F.W. Becker, whose full name was Ferdinand Wilhelm Becker. And as you can see here, he lived from 1797 to 1863. And I'll point out a couple little things to you from this short biography about him. Okay, so firstly, notice here that he studied under Pastor Janicki at the Evangelical Missionary College in Berlin. A lot of things had their start there. And in order to strengthen himself for missionary work, he walked from Elberfeld to Berlin in 16 days. That might not sound like much until you look at Google Maps and realize that's over 500 kilometers that young Becker walked in 16 days. Okay, we're going to turn the page. Feel free to pause this if you want to read it in greater detail. I haven't mentioned this yet, but I'm working off of these presentations, which I also make available in the PDF collection. So, if you want to spend more time on this, or if looking at the video makes it a little fuzzier, you're going to get a clearer type if you look at the original. So those are available also as a resource. Okay, we see here that F.W. Becker, there's a picture of this this influential missionary. And so it looks like he worked closely with the Reverend Alexander McCall in Poland, and then they also studied together earlier. More about McCall later. Apparently, he had given a certain rabbi, this individual is going to come up later too, Rabbi Schwarzenberg. Becker gave him a tract, and then through this, Schwarzenberg came to believe in Yeshua. He actually immersed himself, and he continued to live in the Jewish community, and to some degree continue to live as a Jewish person. He was one of the first people that we're aware of that did this. So we'll learn more about him later. But behind Rabbi Schwarzenberg was F.W. Becker. If you look down here, you can see that the Jewish people in Warsaw actually called Becker the tzaddik. He was such a people they could just tell he was a good man. And then finally, this is notable. Becker's last word on January 24th, 1863, was the name of Yeshua. Delitzsch said about his relationship with F.W. Becker, I had brought some knowledge of Hebrew with me from the gymnasium, and this language was my favorite study. I made the beginning in rabbinical Hebrew with the treatise Or La'et Erev, Light at Evening, which missionary Becker read with me. Now, when they call me a celebrated Hebraist, it sounds almost strange that missionary Becker gave me the first instruction in rabbinical Hebrew. But so it is. So, inspired by F.W. Becker, Delitzsch goes on to say that, quote, I devoted myself, on the other hand, entirely to Hebrew and Old Testament studies. This led me to the School of Rosenmueller, where I was brought into connection with Fleischer and my dear Paul Kaspari. So let's have a quick look at these three individuals, Rosenmueller, Fleischer, and Kaspari. So firstly, a little bit about Ernst Friedrich Karl Rosenmueller. As you can see, he became identified with the U of L, first as a student, and then as an ordinary professor. Remember, that's the one who actually gets a chair of Oriental languages from 1813 until he died in 1835. So that's notable. So Rosenmueller was a professor. And when you see Oriental here, I think nowadays we think, oh, that's like an old word for Asian. But back in the day, it definitely also encompassed the Middle East. So where you see talk about Orientalists and Oriental languages, just think Middle Eastern languages there. Okay, so he was an ordinary professor of Middle Eastern languages for over 20 years in Leipzig. Notably, he died in 1835, which was, let's see, pretty much the same year that Delitzsch became a professor extraordinarius. I don't know if there was, you could even see there being something of a passing of the baton, but definitely a little bit of overlap there. All right, so Delitzsch also mentioned Fleischer. Here's a little bit about Heinrich Lebrecht Fleischer, who you can see there. And so as you can see, he was born in 1801, so he was 12 years older than Delitzsch, roughly, died 2 years before Delitzsch, and he was a German Orientalist. And once again, now you know what an Orientalist is. So notably about Fleischer, he came to Leipzig in 1836, as you can see here, and he stayed there until 1888, even though he was invited to accept similar positions in St. Petersburg and Berlin. As you'll see in a little bit, Leipzig was something of a hive of Orientalists. There was a lot of study going on there of Middle Eastern languages, Hebrew, Arabic, etc. And some of the greatest scholastic heavyweights of the time, when it came to Orientalism, they set up their home base in Leipzig. Really, so definitely a key place for Delitzsch to be. So let's see. He first came to Leipzig when Delitzsch was 24 years old, notably. And about this contact, Curtis writes, he was first a pupil and then an intimate friend of the famous Arabic scholar, Professor Fleischer, until the death of the latter in 1888. Von Aureli relates that after Delitzsch returned from Erlangen to Leipzig, when he was 54 years of age, he attended Fleischer's society with the students. And finally, this is Delitzsch's very dear Paul Kaspari. And what I want you to notice here specifically is that he was at the U of L from 1834 to 1838, where he acquired a knowledge of Arabic, and here's another quote, Oriental language, Persian, under Fleischer. So he was studying under Fleischer along with Delitzsch. And then, reading on, partly from the influence of fellow students, among whom was Franz Delitzsch, he adopted Christianity and was baptized with the middle name Paul in 1838. His Jewish training naturally fitted him for work in Old Testament exegesis. All right, so basically, he was in Leipzig when Delitzsch was like roughly 21 to 25 years old. And we're going to jump now to the next page in this wiki article. As you can see, it sounds like they may have collaborated, or at the very least, they both contributed to some of the same works. You can see that here, contributions to the introduction to the book of Isaiah, Delitzsch and Kaspari's work, which was published in Berlin in 1848. A little bit more about Kaspari. He's mentioned in this, which will be another one of our sources, Some Jewish Witnesses for Christ, published in 1909. You could buy it for $1 and 6 And the editor was the Reverend Bernstein, who was something of a mover and a shaker in the early Hebrew Christian movement. All right, so this is useful, though. It's hundreds of pages long and has tons of biographies of Jewish believers in Yeshua from the 1800s. And there we discover a little bit more about Kaspari. We won't read all of this. I'll just point out a couple things to you that I put in bold so they would jump out for us. Okay, so he goes to Leipzig in 1838 to study, quote, Oriental languages. He writes on his desk, "Thou canst, therefore thou oughtest." I assume that wasn't English that he wrote, though, so what would be a more dynamic equivalent? You can, therefore you should. Rather powerful thing to say, actually. Okay, so anyways, one of their classmates was Granel. And this classmate persuaded Kaspari to carefully read the New Testament. He opened the book at the Acts of the Apostles and read of Paul's persecution by the Jews. He was impressed with the truthfulness of the narrative, and so he concluded to continue his reading. When he reached the Gospels, the words of Christ and the accounts of his wonderful miracles greatly affected him. The thought came to him, perhaps Jesus can also help me out of all this misery which I find in my soul. Pastor Wolf of Leipzig and the young theologian Franz Delitzsch, afterwards the celebrated professor, together with Granel, dealt with him faithfully in this time of struggle. So that's a little bit about the friendship between Kaspari and Delitzsch, and here's the rest of that article if you want to pause and read it all. Do feel free. Here's a picture of Kaspari in his younger years. Delitzsch said of him, "Our dear Paul Kaspari, our aim was the same, and although we were very different, we loved each other and were very close." Biographer Curtis writes, "The most cherished companion of his student days in the university, with whom he says he lived like a dove in one nest, was C.P. Kaspari, now professor in Christiania. His first famulus, as has been remarked, was also a Jewish proselyte, Bernard Kaspari, brother of the one just mentioned." And if you look up the definition for famulus, you will get something like an assistant or servant, especially one working for a magician or scholar. So apparently Delitzsch wasn't just close friends with Kaspari. Kaspari's brother Bernard was also a Jewish person who came to believe in Yeshua, and he worked for Delitzsch. All right, Delitzsch's last defining Jewish relationship that we will look at in this first episode is that of Julius First, whose original Hebrew name apparently was Joseph Al-Sari, Jewish German Orientalist, a scholar of Semitic languages and literature. As you can see here, he was a professor at the U of L from 1864 to 1873. And I'll give you a quick summary of a bit of his life. He grew up a religious Jew, studied in Berlin, Posen, Breslau, and Halle, under, amongst other people, Hegel, Neander, and Gesenius. In 1833, First moved to Leipzig. So he was 28 at the time, and Delitzsch was 20. And you can see there's a bit of a mention of this here. As one of the exponents of the University of Leipzig's academic scholarly milieu, he was a contemporary friend, sometimes collaborator of Leipzig's own native Lutheran scholar and Professor Franz Delitzsch, and First was roughly 8 years older than Delitzsch. Okay, so that's a little bit about Franz Julius First. SDF Solmond writes in his biography, "The teacher whom he esteemed most as a young man, and for whom he took the lance, was the well-known Hebrew lexicographer and scholar Julius First, himself of Jewish extraction. His association with First, who, in spite of his theories as to biliteral roots and the like, was a man of extensive erudition and a very competent teacher, was of great use to him. It lasted over 10 years, and made him familiar with the genius of the Jewish writers. He worked with First in the preparation of his concordance, and obtained generous recognition of his services in that connection in the preface to that laborious work." Curtis similarly writes, "He read all the proofs of First's concordance before he was 27 years old, besides doubtless furnishing the Latin definitions and the preface. If anyone wishes to get an impression of the magnitude of the undertaking, let him examine this concordance. His services in all these directions were not slight. Whatever he did with his whole heart." Towards the end of this time of study under First, he told Delitzsch, "I cannot teach you anything more. You know as much as I do." So, wrapping up this look at Delitzsch's budding academic career, very formative years at the U of L in Leipzig, I thought this was rather insightful. So there's another little biography that I didn't mention yet by Thomas Kelly Shane. It's to be found in his book, The Founders of Old Testament Criticism. Came out in 1893, as you can see here. And there's a mention of Delitzsch right here, page 149. He has a summary of these years and the teachers that Delitzsch learned from. And I'll point out a couple of specific little quotes to you here. He says, "It's important to notice that young Delitzsch came under no great theologian's personal influence." And he mentions some theologians in other cities. Neither of them had a faculty for the deepest problems. I think that this seeming misfortune was really a gain for Delitzsch. He was too original to be molded. Himself was his best teacher, or rather, as we shall see, Providence guided him step by step so that his life was a continuous self-education. He goes on down here to say, in one point, however, Leipzig had perhaps more to offer Delitzsch than Berlin. First was a greater Hebrew scholar than Biesenthal, afterwards a missionary to the German Jews and Delitzsch's fast friend, and in the young Arabist Fleischer, Leipzig possessed the man whom all European scholars were to acknowledge as their leader. What First and Delitzsch were to each other may be learned from the preface to his Hebrew Concordance. What Fleischer was to Delitzsch appears from many philological notes marked FL in the commentaries of the latter. And from we'll just finish this little part right here. Delitzsch had now a well-defined aim. He had begun to learn Hebrew at the gymnasium, but it was the apparent accident of his meeting two agents of the London Missionary Society for promoting Christianity among the Jews, that's a long name, which made him, quote, draw all his cares and studies this way, namely, to make the Old Testament better known to Christians and the New Testament to Jews. So it was these years, Delitzsch's teens and 20s, where he really found his calling and began to find his own voice and find his aim, which was becoming increasingly well-defined, to make the Old Testament better known to Christians and the New Testament to Jews. And with that insightful summary, we will finish this first episode in our Messianic history series. So that was the birth, the childhood, and the formative young manhood years of Professor Franz Delitzsch up to his early 30s, his developmental years, especially at the U of L, early spiritual growth, budding academic career, and some of his first Jewish relationships. In our next episode, Professor Franz Delitzsch is going to get married, and he's going to move away. And I do hope that you will join me as we continue with this story of this great man, this central figure in early Messianic Jewish history.